Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dania. This is episode 2 of the Everyday Man series I started last week, where I talked to 3 men that I know who are fathers and husbands. They are building a future for their families while putting in the work to better themselves so they can be better fathers and husbands. These are true heroes in our lives, but do not get the praise they deserve. In this second episode of the series, I sit down with my friend Shawn Mahoney. We talk about Shawn's journey through life, focusing on being a better husband and a better father. Shawn and I also discuss the importance of mental health and being aware of managing mental health challenges when they arise. Shawn finally shares his focus area as he gets older, being mindful of how the world is changing and how we need to adapt as men. I really hope you get a lot out of this episode, and if at the end you could leave a 5-star review, I would truly appreciate it. Right, well, Shawn, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for taking the time. Super grateful. And for me, I've never went for a run with any of my guests before the recording, so this is new. But and then as I mentioned, I'm doing a 3-episode series where all 3 guests are, I'm calling it the Everyday Man, but it's basically men that are husbands and fathers, and they're doing their thing, working, and also doing a lot of work on themselves, right, to become better men. And I find that inspiring, and to me, we glorify a lot of men in this world, but guys like yourself don't get enough praise. So,
thank you.
But before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and maybe talk about a little bit about what you do and what excites you and stuff like that.
Sure. I think I think a good story always starts with kind of your birth, right? Like, well, and if you think about an everyday man, I was born in small town Alberta, in Lethbridge. We moved around between Lethbridge, Fort McMurray, Dawson Creek. And I think moving forms you in a way when you see different places. Then I came to school in Calgary. I've been here ever since. I resisted the temptation to introduce myself as my job.
Yeah, and
it's just kind of a funny thing. Like my first instinct was to say, I work here, I do this.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, that's not me.
Yeah.
Actually, that's just what I do. And so, but I will talk about that. I think, maybe I would say in some ways, and maybe a lot of people feel this way is in some ways I'm a misfit. Right, like I've actually traveled through lots of career choices, and working for when I started off, I had university. I made a very logical choice, become a chartered accountant because it was going to pay my bills. I had student debt. It was a horrible choice.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, through some circumstances, the way it happened, and I can tell that story a little bit more in detail. But I realized it wasn't for me, and I made a change, and I went and I did construction and framing, and I kind of for a few years. Which led me to oil and gas accounting, which then led me to becoming a consultant with I think it was the Big 7. It's now the Big 4 consulting firms. I traveled around, worked on, big dollar problems. Moved back home, started my own business. Did that kind of develop for a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And then now I'm working for. I started working for I think kind of Brookfield. As an organization, that didn't fit very well for me, and I've been working for a decade for like a local oil and gas company.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Then progressing through roles, kind of in IT roles, and then now kind of more in an innovation role. It's kind of the last 3 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's kind of my career and life progression in a nutshell. I'm actually married, have 4 kids. I think I'm coming up on 30 years of marriage.
Wow, yeah.
So, when you think about it, that's probably my biggest achievement in a lot of ways, or my wife's biggest achievement. I'm not sure which one.
Yeah, and 4 kids, I mean, that's a huge accomplishment too, right? To be able to raise.
Yeah, or an honor, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you've obviously got this great career, you've got a family, especially 4 kids. How do you find time for yourself?
Well, I think you go through phases. I would have said 2021 was a year where I didn't make good time for myself. I think I felt the negative effects of that. But I think it's really hard when you're like, for example, we adopted a young guy, and so he was 6 when we got him, and so we had kind of almost been empty nesters, and it brought us back. You change, and all of a sudden, you can't both go out at the same time. And so then when you take time for yourself, you're taking time away from your partner, and that creates all kinds of complexities in how you feel about taking time for yourself. That as he's gotten older, again, you remember that pressure kind of comes off as your kids.
Yep.
Doesn't need you. So I think that's actually a perpetual struggle. Like that feels like a lifelong struggle. And then when you take time off, can you get yourself away? Like you can not be at work, or you can not be being a dad, but can you stop ruminating on it? Can you stop thinking about those things? That's the second challenge, right? I think in that conversation. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but I do think that's what I think about is like, well, how do I actually clear my mind? So when I'm, say, off skiing, I'm just skiing.
Yeah.
Or I'm doing a podcast with somebody, I'm just here, I'm just present. And that is a practice. That's a continuing practice, is to to be present in the moment and just let it happen, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of days ago, and we were talking about how important it is to prioritize ourselves. But then there's this aspect of guilt that comes with it, like you said. When you take that time for yourself, you're taking that time away from your partner. And we were talking about it, and I was like, if you're not taking that time for yourself, despite the guilt you may feel, how are you showing up, right? If you're constantly not taking that time for yourself, then you're not really present, perhaps.
Yeah, well, and I say in this last year, I think I just became kind of mentally unhealthy. Like I was unhappy. I was lots of things that I wouldn't. I was said. My anxiety felt really high. I was getting kind of chest pains. Actually went and saw my doctor. Guess what? It was all under my control. Like there was, who's the villain in the story is like, I just didn't do the things that I needed to do to take care of myself, to be a good partner, to be a good employee, to be a good dad. You actually have to take care of yourself first. And, it's easy to say, but it's really easy to not do that.
Yeah.
Like it's way easier to not take time for yourself than it is to take the time.
Absolutely. And I guess knowing that, like, as you mentioned, you went through some experiences recently, has your perspective changed? Like, or was it always something that you thought was important, but obviously struggled with making time for it?
I think that I can't, it's hard to remember old mindsets, but I would say what's kind of things that I observed this year was, with COVID and, the isolation you get, you maybe feel a bit like you have to sacrifice on your values to just not be as lonely. So you go out and hang with people to do things that maybe you wouldn't normally do, but it was, what was available given all the constraints and stuff that we're dealing with. And so, and I actually think, you and I talked about this, like you end up drinking.
Yes.
Because that's what the people are doing. It may not be what, like what a great choice for us today. It's like instead of going for a beer, we went for a run. But I don't know how many people you can actually make that choice with, right?
Well, and I wouldn't have suggested it otherwise, right? Like I knew it's something you would be open to.
But what a way better evening to have when, like you say, then you think about the cascading effects of that. So like we've talked about this, where you have alcohol, or then you have bad sleep, and you wake up and then you add caffeine. Well, caffeine stimulates you, makes you feel more anxious. So then you get to the end of the day, you're still anxious, so you have another glass of wine, which affects your sleep. And so it's not hard to get into these cycles
for sure
that aren't great for you, right? And then, if you add into that, the idea that, breaking those, what is getting away about, maybe breaking patterns and reestablishing healthy ones, one of the things I'm actually really doing that I think is really important, and I'm doing just a small amount, and it was inspired by the Muslim faith, which is, everybody talks about meditating. And I was trying to think about, okay, well, how do I incorporate that in my life? And I thought about, Muslims will pray 5 times a day. And I thought, well, maybe I don't have to seek an answer. I don't have to create my own answer. Why don't I just try to find time to, for me, it's not praying, but it's resetting myself back to my values.
Yeah.
And it can be as little as 5 or 10 minutes.
Absolutely.
And I found that has really changed, more than anything. Like the exercise is great, but just those little resets, 5, 10 minutes, back to what do I care about now? What do I care about now? Okay, go back to those. Is, I think, pretty important.
Yeah, and I think we all kind of go through our journey. So, like you said earlier, it's hard to pinpoint old mindsets. But we often go through this journey, and fortunately, we figure it out at times, right? And then make those changes, and we see those results, and we like to stick to them. And to your point, otherwise we fall into this cycle, and we don't realize how each day, how we compound that impact of poor sleep. It just gets worse and worse and worse, and it keeps adding up. And I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about also is, I know mental health is something that is important to you. Do you mind sharing a little bit about why?
Oh, well, I think I have a family member who actually struggles with mental health, and actually we've had, I've had a couple of people actually in my family deal with it in different ways, and it's super interesting. And so, this one family member, went through this journey, and it's not easy. Like when you watch what a person has to deal with when they're dealing with mental health issues, like nobody wants to claim that space. Nobody wants to come out and say, and so we observe things like they would rather claim they were an alcoholic because an alcoholic is more socially acceptable than someone with mental health issues, right? And so, she literally would drink to create the proof.
Yeah.
And it's just, so like you think about the stigma and how what does that mean, right? But, when you're there, and one of the things I was able to do is, we went to this session, and they were talking about the program they were in, and they talked about cognitive behavior therapy. And, they were talking about depression.
Yeah.
And they were talking about what it felt like, and I'm like, well, I know that feeling. And they were talking about, some of the things around maybe someone who's bipolar. And it's like, well, I know that feeling. I maybe don't have it in the same degree.
Yeah.
But it made you kind of go and say, one, to say, I'm only 1 degree away from this. Like, this is not far from me. Two, man, it's a burden for people who have it. And so you really should try to take care as best you can of what you have when you have it, because if you lose it, it's really hard to get back.
Yes.
Right? It's really a struggle to get back, and you probably don't want that struggle in your life if you can avoid it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I've been fortunate enough, like as I'm becoming or studying psychology, going through the DSM-5, where they talk about the different disorders. It's one of the things is like we often tend to label people, right? And when you start going through it, you can either start diagnosing people, or you can have compassion and understand that we all, to your point, exhibit certain disorders. Occasionally we'll check off some of the boxes, especially if we're having a bad day or we're going through a tough time. So I think it's important to have compassion that we can all fall into it. And then also have compassion for people that do struggle with it, right? Because it is, like, if you were to ask them deep down inside, they would tell you that it's not something that they enjoy, obviously, right? And it's such a tough cycle for them to break. And CBT is definitely one way that you can help, but there are other ways. But yeah, so I think for you to be able to experience that, do you feel like having that experience makes you more aware, and makes you put priority on your own mental health?
I think the journey for me started was, what's really interesting because, when you kind of grow up a person, this was a very close sibling, lots of time together.
Yeah.
I'm the youngest, so everybody influenced my thinking. And first one was the question is like, well, what do I think now that was given to me maybe by somebody who's perceiving the world very differently?
Yeah.
Is there anything that's kind of grown in there? And then you kind of, the second thing that you say is like, well, this wasn't detectable for 40 years. So like you say, well, you can be healthy and then unhealthy.
Yeah.
Later. So to your point is like, well, okay, well, I don't know what tips that, but yeah, I should pay attention to this. So I think it does, and then it, like you say, you immediately start to reflect because you have personal experience in it. And you see the heartache for them, and you see the heartache on your family, and you see the difficulty it creates for people. It's like, yeah, this is tough. Like, I need to do a good job to make sure I don't put myself into this spot somehow, right?
For sure, yeah. And then I guess being a father to 4 children, like, what are some things you do to kind of, like do your own healing and your own work? And I know we've talked about these things, but like, obviously I know you really value your relationship with your children, but like, yeah, so.
Well, the one, I'm going to refer to another in your podcast, but I think, and I can't remember the name of it, but the guy was talking about the dad work. And it hit me quite deep, right? Because sometimes we're not the guy we want to be, and there's nothing more important than being a good dad. Like really, because these people need you.
Yeah.
And so I think I think the hardest thing about being a dad is how you feel about even little mistakes.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think the magnification of that can lead to some fairly hard self-talk. Right? Like I think you can kind of go, that was stupid. I'm really stupid. Why am I, and it's funny. And so, like, I've actually gone through a process of kind of, thinking about, from that podcast, making sure, like, hey, just so you know, you're the most important thing to me.
Yeah.
And at times I haven't always been there in the way that I like to show up.
Yeah.
But, I'm going to recommit to that for you. And that led to really good things, right? Like, and so, so I know I'm not answering your question directly, but I think that's what I think about is, and my dad talks about that. He talks about, as you age, the things you did wrong become bigger, and the things that were great get smaller. It's harder to remember the happy moments. And so it was a great and a horrible thing to tell somebody, but if that's true for everybody, and I don't know if it will be true for me, you have to be conscious to protect yourself for how you're going to feel when you maybe have less things to do other than think about your past. At 80, do you want to be sitting thinking about all the stupid things you did? Or do you want to be thinking about all the great memories you were able to create, right? And then, be able to kind of bring that with confidence and kind of into the lives of your children and your grandchildren and all of that. So that's a bit heavy, I know, but, and then on a simple thing, it's just like, kids don't need that much. They need you to be present. They need you to be kind of listening to whatever they're interested in, and, like, it's like, oh, Pokemon today. Or whatever it is, they score 2 goals in their game, or, they got this new thing. Like, it's actually quite simple. What's hard is the rest of the world that actually jumbles you up, work stresses, and you come home after a long day, and your kid's happy to see you, but you're just frazzled, and so you want to have a nap, or you want to do something else. I think it's those transitions that kind of eat us up.
Yeah.
But I think the kids, like it is quite simple. Help them with their homework. Help them reach an apple in a tree. It's just that little feeling of that someone was there for them, right? For sure.
And I guess when you said you had those types of conversations, like, how was it received?
Oh, like you say, I think I had my oldest son. I was talking to him about it. He was in the house at the time, so I just went down and said, I just want you to know you've always been a great kid. And I know, we've had our ups and downs, and I know I haven't always done a good job, but you have always been a good person. He kind of shakes his head. He's waking up, getting in bed. He's like, wow, That's actually really nice. That's a nice way to wake up. Thank you, And, I think this is from conversations with you, and my kids are older, but it turns out it matters. It matters,
yeah.
What your parents say to you, how they actually view you, if they value you, even when you're 30, to be valued by your parents is pretty important, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And then the other thing you said, like, based on what your dad said, like, as you get older, the mistakes you've made feel bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And the good things you've done probably don't feel as great, or they're probably small in value. What do you think about that? Like, I obviously have my own thoughts, but
And where does that take you? I'm curious, like...
well, I think fundamentally we're wired to think that way, but there's something, personally, I think that's a wrong way of looking at life, right? And I think the conversations we've had offline around even just parenting, and I obviously have had to change my mindset around it and recognizing that, yes, I am human, I am going to make mistakes, and I have to forgive myself. But, I think we've talked about being able to take that ownership in front of our children, saying, hey, you know what? Be the first one. I messed up here, and I'm sorry, and I'm going to make sure I do better next time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in itself is huge, because now your kids know, okay, well, dad or mom, or they know, like, I can call them out too, and my son calls me out. But I think when we carry that heaviness throughout our lives, then we're obviously going to be thinking about all the things we did wrong. And I just think it's flawed, because then we're not giving ourselves enough credit. We're not having enough compassion for ourselves.
And if I was to turn a corner, kind of emotionally on that, I think what I wanted to kind of make sure I was kind of, it's easy to talk about all the good things, and this is great, and that kind of stuff. But like courage, can you be courageous if you're not scared? Right? Like, if you don't feel fear, you just kind of run over, do whatever the thing is.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that courage, or is it just like, is nothing to you? Whereas if you're scared and you overcome it, well, that's courage.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we started this conversation, we're talking about the heavy things, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's important to acknowledge, hey, like, we could talk all day long about the great things and make it sound like it's just a picnic that we get to do. But the truth is, there's a lot of hard feelings in being a parent. There's a lot of hard feelings in being a husband and a son and a worker or employee or whatever. And, it isn't about always being able to get to feel good. It's about how do you do the right thing when you're not feeling good. Right? That's the courage, that it takes, in that moment when maybe you're frazzled and you're freaked out from work and your kids maybe kind of driving you crazy because they're, screaming and running around. That's the moment to be a great dad. Not when it's really easy and you're on vacation and, you're in a great headspace. Like, yeah, that's easy then.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? And so I think that's kind of the importance of kind of acknowledging, yeah, my dad's right. My dad does a good job showing up. Right? So he comes and he goofs around with my kids and stuff. But every once in a while he'll talk about maybe what's in his mind. And you go, oh, I wouldn't have known. Thank you for the heads up that I may have to deal with that. But thank you also for having the courage to show up, despite all that, what you're feeling, in a way that actually makes it pretty easy for us to hang around here. Right?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. And I think that's where it's important to have those conversations. And I think I've gone through that same journey with my parents. So even if they are thinking, hey, we made all these mistakes, it's like, no, mom and dad, like, you guys did your best. Now it's my job to, like, deal with it, right? Like, you did your best. You had the best intentions at all times. Of course you're gonna make mistakes. And I've said this before. It's not like you had this manual to read and be like, oh, follow through, right? So I think we're hard on ourselves. And to your point, I think there's also an aspect. If we didn't have that level of accountability, then we wouldn't always hold ourselves to a standard, right? So I think it's finding the right balance. You need a bit of both, and often people tend to fall on the other side of the spectrum, where they're just really hard on themselves.
Yeah, and I do think that does take practice to kind of make sure that, hey, come on. I know, yeah, well said, is I guess what I would say to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess, I mean, as a husband as well, I mean, that's a huge role, and you alluded to that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like, what are some things that, you do, again, to feel like, okay, these are my goals to be a better husband, or, for other men that are listening?
I'm lucky, and I think this is the thing is, like, I actually really like my wife as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a good person, and she has really high values, and she's if anything, she gives too much of herself, but like as a person, when I look across the dinner table, I'm like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she inspires me to try to be, or reminds me that I need to keep working to maybe make a higher level of me. But so number one is that. I think that I think like marriage is long.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and I don't know anybody else's experience, I only have mine, but like, part of me thinks that you're going to hit a rough patch. And I could say, we've had rough patches that lasted months and years. And, we were lucky enough maybe to that not be a thing that stuck with us for 5 years. Like, that somehow we both wanted to work on it, we both kind of kept aligned, and we kind of found a way through it. But like, maybe not feeling great, like everything's great in your relationship for like, 12 months, 14 months. That's a long time. And I don't think they really put that in the advertisements that, if you want to be married 30 years, you might have some literally years where you're not feeling great about it, you're not feeling great about yourself, you kind of lose a connection. The kids are a great example. Kids very much pull, because your primary focus is the kid.
Yeah.
And initially it's easy because the kids are small. But as the kids kind of get older and more independent, then you kind of have to find a way to reconnect back, or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges to any relationship is children, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And surviving children.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to remember, what I've kind of learned is, like, man, like my wife said something to me, like after something I've been doing for like 20 years, probably 20 years. And she goes, I'll give you the exact example. We would fight. In my family, you've wronged me, I'm going to give you the cold shoulder, and then when I'm feeling better, I will forgive you. And
yeah, yeah, it's
and then
basically it's your process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But literally, like after 20 years, she goes, I know we're going to fight sometimes, but I really upsets me if we go to bed and you don't put your arm around me or let me know that, it's still okay. Like, I feel really bad. And she may have said it to me before, like, but after this point, 20 years, I was like, well, I don't want that.
Yeah.
Right? I heard it. And, and of course, then you feel bad because, like, why didn't I hear that? Like 15 years ago? But I think in that moment, like, I think that was the thing. It's just like, I can change that. And so, but like, boy, like, as the example, it's like, it's the last thing I want to do when I'm mad at somebody is to, cuddle them. Or,
yeah.
But, good for her for having the courage to just kind of say, this is something you could do that would make a big difference in my life. And it was something that I could actually action quite easily. Like, she didn't really need me to change me fundamentally. It was a gesture that told her I still loved her even though I was mad at her. And so I think the two kind of learnings in that story is like, well, try to be as good a listener and try to get to those kind of conversations as early can in a relationship.
Yeah.
Right? Like 20 years is probably a bit on the long side to figure something out as simple as that. But, well, it might take 20 years to sometimes figure out some things about someone you love.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, sometimes people don't figure those simple things out either, right? And I think as you were telling that story, what clicked for me is we all carry these patterns from our childhood, right? And we just, like, maybe your wife did mention it early on in your relationship, right? And you were just, at that point, you were like, well, I've been doing this my whole life. That's how I'm wired.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean there's something wrong with this, right? And
because that behavior was reinforced when you were growing up.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting, right? And you know, I think it's important where people, especially in their relationships, can have those conversations. Like if you can just do this, don't change yourself, but this is what I need in those moments. It's really important.
But I think it feels funner. Like now I can remember a mindset, and I think when you're young and you're maybe not as introspective and you're not thinking about all, you know, how you're impacting the world, it feels funner because you don't have all the cares. And so there is a burden that comes with kind of all these experiences and learnings, right? That it's like, oh yeah, I should be careful how I do that. I should think about this. And it's good. But I do miss the freedom of just being able to just, you know, run around and be stupid and probably, I think when you're young, people also are more resilient to the things you say and do. So it's not as, nothing carries the same weight. You know, it feels like when you're, you know, 18 or 19, you know, the wounds seem small, but maybe they're not.
Yeah. Well, I think as we get older, the people we surround ourselves with gets, like, that social circle gets smaller too. So now you're likely spending more time with people that you really, really care about.
That's true. It's deeper too, right?
Yeah.
You're right. So in a random conversation, if you kind of screw up and it's someone you have a, what do you call it, almost like an incidental relationship with, it doesn't feel as bad as, well, you're a 10-year friend and I've hurt your feelings. That's going to feel worse. Or you're my kid or you're my wife.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to wear that more. That's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, I mean, what's kind of on your path now, like as you see, you know, moving forward, like as a man with kids and a husband, like obviously kids are getting older, like where do you see things going and what are your priorities?
I actually think fundamentally, and I'm lucky that I think I detected this, and I didn't detect it quickly, but I think the world has changed. And I think, I was looking at humor, I actually was watching a show, and I noticed the humor was much more gentle. Like it wasn't, you know, it was goofier, it was this kind of little, you know, I can't remember the interplay, but the person's comment was something like, oh, well, thank you for noticing. And it wasn't sarcastic, it wasn't, you know, and I think about the humor that I grew up in, and, you know, the type of humor was really almost attacking people. And I thought, well, that's probably a little bit of maybe that, you know, my children are actually want to be gentler to each other. That the world wants to be a lot gentler. And it's like, that's a good thing. And so, you know, I think it's really easy to kind of dismiss, well, everybody's so sensitive now, and, you know, I said this thing and everybody's offended, and, you know, I'm not, you know, this term microaggression, you know, like, it's how it lands, it's not how you deliver it, right? And so those can be complicated things to think about.
Yeah.
And especially when you've grown up in, you know, with humor and social norms that are more aggressive and, you know, maybe probably actually laced with microaggression. But when you actually look at that, you can feel very threatened on one hand. You can feel, oh, well, this is very threatening to me in my age. I grew up in a different thing. Or you could say, this is awesome. Like, actually, wow. You know, all the things I worry about for my children, I maybe don't have to worry about them growing up in a less kind world. Like people want to be kinder. And I think that's a big deal.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you mentioned that, because for me, I look at things like, well, I'm going to speak my mind. I'm going to be blunt. And it's, you know, I didn't really put it together, but you're right, it's not how it's delivered, it's how it's received. And, you know, often when you're being too honest, it can almost come across as a microaggression comment or whatever, right? And yeah, I think it's important to be mindful of those things, and it's something I'm going to take away for sure from this conversation.
There's and you heard that, is it radical candor? Have you heard of this?
No.
And it's, you know, yeah, you know, it kind of blew my mind, and it blew my mind because I'm not sure what to do with it. But, you know, you know, at work there's this thing, and they're talking about radical candor, and the power of radical candor can be really great because, you know, if people want feedback, and if you can actually be very honest and direct in your feedback, it can be really helpful. But she creates a quadrant. I can't remember what the quadrants were, but one of them, like right below radical candor, is like, so it's about caring and honesty. So if you really care about a person and you're really honest, it's radical candor, it's up at the top right, and that sounds great. But if you don't care quite enough about the person and you're radically honest, it kind of means you're a jerk, right? You're not a good person, right? And or if you don't care enough and you're not honest enough,
Yeah.
you're kind of this apathetic person, and you really don't care how the world goes. You don't really kind of care to give any kind of honesty.
Right. You have like, yeah.
It's almost passive aggressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting, and like I haven't processed it to the point where I feel like I could execute it, and I'm not sure, like, like in a home setting I can see it, or in a friend setting. I'm not sure how it plays out in a work setting, because
Yeah.
Can you have enough caring in a work setting to do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's tough, I think. But I do think most of our most difficult conversations are at home or
Yeah, that's true.
at friends, right? With friends at least. I remember, I think I was sitting through a workshop and the lady was like, she's like, you have to, like, we're really mindful of how we speak to our coworkers.
Yeah.
And we're not as much when it's our partners or our family members. And she's like, well, if you ever needed a kidney, guess who's going to be there?
You don't want to burn that bridge when you need a kidney. That's a good line.
So, yeah. So, I mean, moral of the story, I think we need to be really aware and mindful of how we speak to the people that we live with, or our family members or our close friends.
I had a conversation. So I was actually, talking to a therapist, and I said, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do with my social support network.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know it's really important. I know it's like, one of the best predictors of mental health, positive mental health, is having a strong social.
Yeah.
But it's like, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do. Like, am I supposed to like lay it all out there, give him all my problems? Am I supposed to? And he goes, I think you're. And he goes, good question. He goes, but I think you're just supposed to enjoy spending time with them. It's just, way too really simple answer. And I'm overanalyzing my head, and it's just like, but sometimes, and I thought about that. It's just like, you go with a friend, and what I was saying is, something common happens to you, maybe happens to everybody, is I come, and you don't do this, I don't think, but I'll come say, I'll just want to unload my problems a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And what usually happens when you do that is they start to unload their problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe you wanted support in that moment, and you get kind of emotionally trumped by the other person.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if I do that. Like, I wonder, and I think the person's probably trying to show, oh, I understand, I have the same thing happening.
Yeah, because often the perception is misery needs company.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think the biggest thing I learned when I started the counseling program is emphatic listening, right? And again, it's a fine line, because my initial approach too is like, if someone's telling me a tough story, would be like, try to relate, and you're not really validating the person.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're sharing something, it's reflecting back to them how they must be feeling, and truly validating the experience for them. And that is an art, right? Like, obviously, like, I'm going to school for it.
Yeah.
So it yeah. And I really have to work hard when someone's sharing something, is to just ground myself and listen. And I think the podcast really helps with that. I've gotten a lot of practice doing that.
Interesting.
But yeah, and I think sometimes, as friends, and like, I'm fortunate enough to run a men's group, so I get to experience that too, where a lot of these guys come in. Obviously, there's things you can't really talk to your partner about, or especially if you both are struggling with something. If it's related to your kids or something going on at home, you can't have that conversation with your partner. So for these men, this men's group is a huge outlet. And one of the biggest, I had to do tons of research on facilitating men's groups, and again, you have to give them that time and space, and not chime in with, oh yeah, I had this experience once too, and this is what I did.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people don't want a solution. They just want to be heard. And that's taken me tons of practice. And even in relationships, right? Like if your partner comes to you, often she might not be looking for a solution. She just wants to be heard. And as men, our go-to is like, well, you come here with a problem, I'll send you with a solution.
Yeah, my job is, it's not our job. It's
No.
not what people need. It's making me just think about even the conversations I had today, like just at work, that I listen enough. And I think what erodes our ability to listen? Urgency.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe uncomfort,
Mm-hmm.
as we kind of feel anxious. Maybe something creates anxiety.
Yeah.
Right? But it immediately just kind of made me want to double down on, got to double down on that one.
Yeah.
That's one that every time I've done it just gets such good results.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just such a good thing to do all the time. And, but it's so hard to do all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've been seeing these memes or whatever on Instagram, and they talk about there's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So we listen twice as much.
Yeah, I think it is kind of funny, so many things are so simple and known. I mean, we have a common friend, right? We talk about this generous orthodoxy, right?
Yeah.
And you go back to this idea of these older things that have been known for centuries, right? Millennium.
Mm-hmm.
And, she would argue that it's all known. We just need to be respectful of this past and learn it. And there's some truth to that for sure,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But equally, the world seems to be changing so fast that we need to be prepared. And I think you and I would maybe kind of agree on this, is be able to be prepared to adapt maybe those learnings to fit better
In today's times.
in today's times.
Yeah.
So it's not that you're throwing them out, but it's just like, it's not a verbatim translation that you would use today.
No, because I think a lot of it would be lost in meaning
Mm-hmm.
or translation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that's that's a whole different can of worms.
Yeah, that's super cool.
Yeah.
And you've been sharing those with me too, like just different, is it Marcus Aurelius?
Yeah, I've been delving deep into Stoicism and a little bit of quantum physics and combining the two. It's cool to see because I think the engineer in me gravitates towards. I mean, as much as I have tried to move away from engineering, I still gravitate towards the science behind it. But I think the wisdom is equally important because these men lived these lives, and obviously they, did well. I mean, we don't know how they survived, but their teachings have been, or practices have been passed down for generations.
For sure. Yeah.
So clearly they were doing something right. But then the science just makes it go around for me, someone like me.
Yeah, wow. I think I'm fairly rational, fairly analytical, and I think that that's kind of how I approach the world too.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, and maybe that's a man thing. I don't know. Like, I've never been another gender.
Yeah.
Yeah, but as we talk about some of the things we're talking about, is being comfortable with some of those other things, right? Like being okay not to have the answer, just to be empathetic.
Mm-hmm.
Being okay just to listen and not solve.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think it's really interesting that back, and I'm just only talking about these things because I've listened to your podcast lately too, but it's, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a man today? What will it mean to be a man in the future?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about it, I think about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, am I preparing myself? Who wants to be that guy? That's like, everyone's like, oh yeah, he's just, he's a little stickler on this stuff. He's having trouble, with this. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to be that guy, ever.
Yeah.
I want to be able to talk to my grandkids and be able to relate to them
Mm-hmm.
just as much as I relate to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which means I'm going to have to change.
Well, yeah, and I think there's an aspect of just staying young and being able to adapt, like you said, because our brains are truly plastic.
Yeah.
And you'll have to constantly be trying to adapt to those things, so your brain keeps changing shape or
Is it plasticity or is it elasticity? Is it the actual? Which is these? You know, have you seen those things? Where
yeah. From a material standpoint, it's so there's elastic is where it can come back. Plastic is where
it can reshape.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think you've seen those studies where someone loses their ability to have balance, and they put a hard hat and they put the sensors on their tongue. And the research is super interesting. The researcher says we just need to get the signal to the brain. The brain will know what to do with it. Like, we don't have to. And so basically, somehow, you know, with the gyroscope in the helmet, and like your tongue learns how to perceive those signals, and your brain knows how to make it balance you.
Yeah.
Somehow.
I mean, there's tons of research I've read where, because there's the motory sensors and then like the sense.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So those, like often those neurotic or I think it's synaptic connections don't break off. Mm-hmm. So if you're able to keep them firing, then you can maintain some of those movements, even though you may not be able to like actually perceive it.
Interesting.
Yeah. There's a
That's
lot.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes on in there, but yeah. So I guess as we come to a close here, Shawn, like again, knowing this is kind of the everyday man, like what would you like to offer to men who are kind of similar to yourself, and as you mentioned, the way the world is shifting? What would you like to offer as guidance?
You know, I actually think we kind of covered a lot of the stuff. You know, I think this idea of courage, right? It's doing the right thing or trying to be your better self when maybe it doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
You know, and that's hard to do. I like the whole conversation about maintaining your ability to adapt. Like, check yourself, right? Like, it's easy to get locked. It's so easy. And I do like this idea of, you know, keep the hope of your mental plasticity, right? Like, your brain can probably do it. You know, and keep your brain trained in that. Give it lots of chances to kind of do and try different things. And I think that's, and I think you actually nailed it when you said, you know, these things get smaller. But it doesn't actually have to be that way. You and I are relatively new friends. You know, so it's like, actually, you can actually, with your experience, not have to go through 100 people to meet people that you actually have connections with. You can recognize them very quickly when you meet them, and then get these great experiences where you're running, doing podcasts, having great conversations, you know, having a tea instead of having a beer. You know, like, there's a bunch of things that opened up when you became friends. And, you know, and I guess the last thing I would say is, you know how you're in a really good mood, and then one thing happens.
Yeah.
And then you're in a really bad mood.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to remember that actually happens both ways.
Yes.
So when you're in a really bad mood, you're probably only one good thing away from being in a really good mood.
Yes.
And it doesn't feel that way. Like, when you're really happy and everything's going great, it feels like everything's awesome.
Yeah.
And then you're feeling bad. It's like, well, that was a horrible. No, that's just what happens.
Yeah.
And now that you're feeling bad, you know, actually, yeah, you just need to go find a good thing. And I think creating those spaces where it's more probable. And again, it's not in a bottle. It's probably in a run. It's by a walk in nature. So increase your probability of good things happening to you is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. The only thing I would add there is, I think for me, what I've started noticing, I guess two things there. When something bad happens, try to note it down.
Oh, yeah.
Like, understand what happened, what was the source, why were you so triggered? You know, was there something else going on subconsciously that little thing made you feel even worse? And then I try to meditate on it to understand, okay, well, what's going on deep down inside for me? The other thing I've started noting, and the more I read about quantum us, like the quantum you, it starts making sense. So when I start feeling like something is irritating me or upsetting me and I'm having a bad day, more things start piling up. And I'm just like, oh, here's another thing. And I think what happens is we attract that energy. It's what we're putting out there, right? And
or we filter it. Like we
Exactly.
we start to filter out the good
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. Because there's, to your point, there's an infinite probability of things happening out there. And we're obviously just picking out the bad ones and attracting them to us. So I think what one of the things is, like, if you do notice something bad, or your feelings down, like, either take a moment for yourself to reflect and see how you can change that around.
You know, it's funny. That's the second time that one's coming to me today. So it must be important. Like, and this is, I also believe in this.
Yeah.
The world will give you the answer.
Yes.
You just need to listen back to your thing. And I actually heard it today, or I read it, that having a journal on your nightstand and taking a little bit of time to just write down
Yeah.
good and the bad of the day,
Yeah.
and just taking that moment to process it. It's like, what would that take you, 10 minutes?
Yeah.
And I believe in this too. Like, I think the power of that also comes in if it doesn't disrupt your sleep, or creating more anxiety. But there's a lot our brain does if I really believe in, if you give your brain a problem before bed, you're likely to wake up with the answer.
Yeah.
And so taking a little bit of time to just give your brain something to kind of chew on in its subconscious is really good to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were talking about Marcus Aurelius. He basically, his book Meditations was his journal, and he would start every day with these thoughts and kind of goals for himself. He's like, yeah, I'm going to meet irritating people throughout the day. That's just reality. How am I going to show up? And Sinaka, on the other side, he would journal before going to bed, and he would do a full reflection on his day. And to your point, yeah, if you do that, you are going to wake up feeling different and with answers potentially.
Well, and if you take the 5 times a day to reflect,
Yeah.
And go back to that. Well, this is who I said I was going to be today. Super interesting.
Yeah. No, this is great. Thank you, Shawn, for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I know we've been talking about this for a while, but typically I ask guests if they want to share social media or any way of, if other listeners want to get hold of them. I don't know if you want to share that. I'll leave it up to you. But
I think all my things are private.
Yeah.
And so I think anybody who's kind of looking for me maybe could find me, on LinkedIn or,
Yeah.
But most of that's, I'm a pretty private person.
Yeah, and that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have private people come on the podcast, but absolutely, and that's why I wanted to ask. So,
But it's a good thing to reflect on. I may come back and maybe think about how I could be more public without necessarily exposing all my private stuff.
Yeah.
I've never taken the time to have a public.
Yeah.
I'm just an everyday guy.
Yeah, well, there you go. You're private and everyday. Yeah, no, that's perfect. No, thank you again. I really appreciate this, and thank you for being so vulnerable. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode. As always, please subscribe to the podcast if you enjoy the episodes, or leave a comment in the comment section. I always love hearing from you. Thank you again, and until next week.